thought it would just be helpful to think about a definition of a democratic deficit. If the question we're trying to answer is, does Cambridge have a democratic deficit, then let's be clear what we're talking about. So useful definition I found, the expression democratic deficit may be used to denote the absence or underdevelopment of key democratic institutions, but it may also be used to describe various ways in which these institutions may fail to function properly, e.g. lack of transparency and accountability, technocratic decision-making, inadequate participation of citizens in policy-making. So that's the kind of issue we're talking about. And as that definition, I think, makes clear, this is not necessarily about deliberate intent to create a democratic deficit. It could also be about inability to live up to the standards that one would want to see achieved. So let's have a think about how that situation plays out in Cambridge. Next slide, please. So my contention would be that our local government is not well equipped to do its job. And I think it's compromised in three areas: money, powers, and structures. So I'm sure you will all be aware, because there are headlines every day pretty much about how all local government is woefully underfunded. Cambridge City Council is now looking at a potential 30% budget saving over the next 5 years. Cambridge County Council has a £28 million funding hole in this financial year. Now, these are huge sums with significant implications. And to exemplify that, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts on how this plays out in the planning service. And we might look at Professor Gavin Parker's work on the increasing importance which councils are placing on the revenue stream provided to them by pre-application discussions with developers as a augmentation to council's funds. We might also look locally at the arrangement Cambridge University came to with the planning department in 2016 to fund 5 planning posts to get its own applications processed faster. And from things I've put on social media in the past, I think a lot of people on this call will be aware that I don't believe we have adequate funding in place for the kind of planning enforcement that we would like to see happening locally. And what that means is that developers get away with things and break the compact with residents and with the council, which is supposed to be achieved by going through a planning process. On the issue of powers, I think it's sometimes hard for people to understand how local government's powers are constrained. There's some kind of folk memory that I come across of councils being quite powerful, and times have changed. And again, to look at a planning example, I think people on this call will be very familiar with the multiple planning applications which have succeeded on appeal, and despite the preferences of Cambridge's planning committee, because developers can resource appeals and because national planning policy overrides local concerns. And the third thing I think I'd talk about is structures. And if you move on to the next slide, please. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this illustration. This was prepared by Smarter Cambridge Transport, a grassroots lobby group, sadly no longer active, to demonstrate the absolute morass of accountabilities and responsibilities we have in local government in this area. And what I would say is that this doesn't even capture all of the complexities. So, for example, we have the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, which is a joint operation between the City Council and South Cambs District Council, and similarly waste services. And there's also 3C shared services, which covers legal, IT and building control, which is a joint operation between the City, South Cambs and Hunts District Council. So it is an absolute morass trying to find out who is responsible, who is making decisions. And sometimes it's the case, well, very often it's the case that residents can't unpick it, but sometimes, as I have discovered, it's the case that officers themselves are unsure, and that's really disconcerting. And a special mention goes out there to the Greater Cambridge Partnership, which would be worth a couple of hours presentation on its own. We're 7 years in. I think still very few people understand its powers and its relationships with local councils. And personally, for anyone thinking about possible democratic deficits, that's where I would start. Okay, next slide, please. So we have weak local government. We also have strong influences acting on that local government. And this is a list of just some of the local business groups who are lobbying either for types of business or for geographical areas, such as the BID covering the city centre or CBC Limited covering the biomedical campus. The relationship between some of these organisations and local government is often described as partnership. And I'm not, and I want to be clear about that, necessarily saying it's a bad thing. For example, Cambridge Ahead produce a quarterly housing dashboard, which has great data in it, and it's very, very useful. And I don't think it's something that the City Council could hope to collate that regularly. And it's great that Cambridge Ahead perform that role. But I think if nothing else, those partnership relationships can lead to a perception of undue influence and behind the scenes lobbying, which is itself damaging to trust. And I think also, given the financial asymmetries and the access which these groups have to national government, it's very hard to see it as a partnership of equals. And I think there are legitimate questions about checks and balances. You know, there's just a lot of discussion of the importance of having one strong voice promoting what is in effect a particular and self-interested vision of the future of the city, which drowns out the plurality of other voices. Small independent businesses, for example, don't feature in the landscape that any of these organisations are really interested in, with the exception of the BID. So weak government, strong actors working on government. And next slide, please. I think we also have a problem with the nature of demographics in Cambridge and how our specific demographics work against local engagement. So we know that compared to the national average, Cambridge's population is young, is relatively transient, is in rented accommodation. More than 40% of Cambridge households are in rented accommodation, and is very international. And particularly with regard to the international element, that creates restrictions on formal participation through voting, but also there are barriers of language and barriers of understanding how the system works here. And I think the totality of those four factors means that it is hard for many people in Cambridge to grapple with these opaque structures that we have. And if you add into that the time and financial pressures which many households are now under, we end up with a situation where a significant proportion of the population is likely to find it too complex and or too irrelevant to engage, or, and I think this is very important and often overlooked, don't have access to the technology to allow them to do so. And I think digital exclusion is becoming a real issue. Interestingly, we also have a background narrative running where the people who are willing to engage then sometimes get told more or less directly that they are too middle class or too privileged for their views to be taken into account. And I would say that putting these two factors together, we probably have the worst of all possible worlds in terms of healthy public engagement with what's going on in the city. Next slide, please. So I think we've got two acid tests of trust and functioning of democracy locally. The first is the GCP's proposals for its sustainable travel zone. The consultation's now running. I think it's very hard for the general public to make sense of this because there's such mixed messaging around it. You know, one member of the GCP board describes it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Another says in apocalyptic tones, there is no plan B. I think it's also sometimes, well, definitely presented as a sort of measure which should be backed because of concerns about climate change. But then the same business lobby groups are at the moment pressing for expansions of transatlantic flights from Stansted Airport to make it easier for their businesses to benefit from those links. I don't know how people are supposed to make sense of those irrationalities. And then I think there's much more practical issues. Do people know about it? I've touched on digital exclusion. I've been told that it's very difficult for people to access background materials. They thought that copies of the documentations would be provided in local libraries. That hasn't happened. Are people actually clear on what's being proposed? Do they know how to have their say? And what's the process after this round of consultation? Because there now appear to be so many variables that we're effectively being asked to comment on a pig in a poke. And importantly, as a councillor, I still don't know whether or how or when the City Council is going to agree a formal response to this consultation. And it's not for lack of asking. With regards to the local plan, well, we're being told that the justification for introducing the sustainable transport zone is because of the exploding growth of the population. And it's certainly true that in the last 20 years, the city's population has grown from around 100,000 to 145,000 residents. The next local plan wants to accelerate that rate of growth. But if we're thinking of this in terms of a possible democratic deficit, it's probably worth reflecting on the fact that no electoral process has ever offered us a choice as to whether residents want that growth. Local plan making is a technocratic process, and going back to the points I made initially, this favours those interests with deep pockets, with a strong financial incentive, and able to stick it out for long time frames. And that's to say, not your average resident. Could I have the last slide, please, Tony? So sorry, this is not very legible, but this graph was shown at a recent event organised by Cambridge Ahead and Centre for Cities, two organisations who are very vocal about promoting continued growth. It shows that Cambridge City and South Cambs have built out at breakneck pace for the last 2 decades, in Cambridge's case at double the national average. But despite that, the gap between housing and population has got worse, not better. Yet the commentary accompanying this slide was, and I quote, "There is demand to live in Cambridge. Supply must keep ahead to ease affordability costs." Now, that's one vision for the future of our city. It's what I described in my talk to FECRA last year as an employment-led model of growth. And I believe that talk is still up, and it will probably help flesh out what I'm talking about here for those who didn't see it. But basically, those advocating for this employment-led model are not only highly motivated, but also extremely well-resourced. And what's interesting to me is not only can they influence the future direction the city takes, they can also insulate their people against many of the resulting negative externalities which other ordinary residents won't be able to escape. And we can already see that happening with the private bus services run to Arm and to Granta Park, which insulate their system from the failure of the bus network, which the rest of us are currently dealing with. And similarly, the University at Eddington and the Wellcome Trust campus have built or are building housing which will be tied to employment with their organisations. My concluding questions would be, do the residents of Cambridge trust that the situation in which we currently find ourselves is the outcome of a democratic process? And do residents trust that it will be possible for them to contribute meaningfully to setting future priorities? And what does it mean for the functioning of local democracy if the answer to either or both of those questions is no? Thank you.